The beam of the helicopter searchlight cuts through the dense canopy, scanning kilometers of Montana wilderness that haven't seen human footfall in decades. It's October 1987, and a Forest Service crew mapping fire access routes has just radioed coordinates that will reopen a case closed 13 years ago. Below them, barely visible through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, sits a weathered cabin with a single word carved deep into its door: Sarah. The name belongs to Sarah Catherine Winters, age 14, who vanished from a family camping trip in the summer of 1974. What happened to her remained Montana's most haunting mystery, until a routine aerial survey and soil analysis technology developed for Vietnam War MIA recovery would finally piece together the truth, a truth carved not just in wood, but in the geological record of the forest floor itself. Missoula in 1974 hummed with the particular energy of a university town nestled against wilderness. Sarah Winters lived on the east side with her parents, Tom and Margaret, and her younger brother, David. Tom worked maintenance at the university, a job he'd held for 8 years after returning from 2 tours in Korea. He was methodical, careful with money, the kind of man who kept receipts in labeled envelopes and changed the oil in their Ford station wagon exactly every 3,000 miles. Margaret taught 4th grade at Lowell Elementary, where parents requested her class specifically because she had a gift for reaching quiet children who struggled to find their voice. They were careful people who saved for modest pleasures, a week each August at a campsite in the Rattlesnake Wilderness, 20 miles northeast of town. The tradition had started in 1972, the summer after Tom's father died. The old man had been a Forest Service ranger, and Tom wanted his children to know the woods the way he had, to understand that wilderness wasn't something to fear, but to respect. Sarah had turned 14 that spring, crossing that threshold between childhood and something else, not quite adolescence, not anymore a little girl. She wore her brown hair in 2 braids, though lately she'd been asking her mother about cutting it short like the girls in the Sears catalogue. She kept a composition notebook where she sketched birds she identified from a field guide her grandfather had given her before his death. The Peterson Field Guide to Western Birds, 1st edition, with his handwriting in the margins, noting where he'd spotted rare species. The notebook went everywhere. So did a small brass compass on a leather cord, a gift from her father after she'd memorized how to read topographic maps. She'd spent an entire winter studying them at the kitchen table, learning to interpret contour lines, to calculate elevation gains, to identify saddles and ridges and drainage patterns. She was methodical that way, learning something completely before moving to the next interest. Last year, it had been cloud identification. The year before, wildflowers. David, at 11, worshipped his older sister in the way younger siblings do when there's just enough age difference to make the older one seem impossibly cool and competent. He'd follow her around the neighborhood carrying his own notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing from Woolworths, trying to sketch the same birds, but never quite managing to capture their essence the way Sarah did. The family had claimed the same campsite, number 17, for 3 consecutive summers. It sat in a clearing beside Rock Creek, with designated fire rings and a Forest Service latrine 100 meters up the trail. The site cost $4 per night. Tom always paid for the full week in advance, getting a receipt that he'd file with the rest of the summer's paperwork when they returned home. Other families scattered through adjacent sites, forming a temporary community that reformed each August with slight variations. The Hendersons from Kalispell, a boisterous family with 5 children who seemed to multiply each year. The Morales family from Butte, Richard and Elena and their twin daughters, who'd become Sarah's friends during previous summers, teaching her Spanish phrases while she taught them bird calls. A young couple from Seattle in a Volkswagen van, newlyweds on their honeymoon, who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the presence of so many children, but smiled politely at the chaos. Tom Winters had a routine, the kind of schedule he'd learned in the military and never quite shaken. Morning coffee at dawn percolated over the fire, while the world still held that particular stillness that exists only in the moments before birds begin their songs. Then he'd walk the creek with David, teaching him to read water for trout, showing him where the big ones held in deep pools, how to identify the subtle dimples on the surface that meant rising fish, the art of moving through water without spooking everything downstream. Margaret would prepare breakfast on the Coleman stove, pancakes from biscuit, bacon in a cast-iron skillet, eggs scrambled with cheese, coffee for the adults. Tang for the children, that orange powder that astronauts drank, mixed in a plastic pitcher. Sarah usually woke early too, slipping away with her notebook to sketch whatever birds appeared at first light. Clark's nutcrackers with their grey bodies and black wings, mountain chickadees singing their three-note call. Once, on the second summer, a northern goshawk that made her hold her breath, perched on a dead pine, not 30 meters from the tent, its fierce yellow eyes scanning for prey. On August 7th, the routine held. Sarah left the tent at 5:45, her mother noted later, because Margaret had glanced at her watch when she heard the zipper. The temperature sat at 52 degrees, cool enough that breath condensed in small clouds. Sarah wore jeans, a green flannel shirt that had belonged to her father before he'd given it to her, and her hiking boots, Red Wing Irish setters, a Christmas gift that she'd broken in carefully over months of weekend hikes. She carried the notebook, the compass, a canteen on her belt filled with water from the campground pump, and a small day pack with crackers, an apple, and a pocket guide to animal tracks that she'd been studying. She'd mentioned the night before that she wanted to get up early to look for evidence of the black bear that the ranger said had been spotted in the area. Not to see the bear itself, she was smarter than that, but to find tracks, scat, claw marks on trees. "Stay on the marked trails," her mother said, still half asleep in her sleeping bag, speaking the words she spoke every morning without really thinking about them anymore, a ritual of parental concern. "I always do," Sarah replied. Those were the last words anyone in her family would hear her speak. When Sarah hadn't returned by 8:30, Tom began a methodical circuit of the immediate trails. He checked the creek path first, the route she usually took, following it downstream for half a mile before turning back. Then the loop to Sugarloaf Rock, a granite outcropping popular for its view of the valley. Then the fire access road that ran behind the campground, rarely used but sometimes interesting for birdwatching because it opened up the canopy. Other campers joined him. Richard Morales and his twin daughters walked the perimeter of the campground, checking the latrines, the water pump, every picnic table and fire ring. The young couple from Seattle drove their van slowly down the main road, stopping at every pullout and trailhead. By 10, when the heat climbed into the low 70s and Sarah still hadn't appeared at any of the usual spots, Margaret drove their Ford station wagon to the ranger station, driving too fast on the gravel road, skidding slightly on the turns. Ranger Paul Deakins had worked the Rattlesnake District for 11 years. He'd coordinated searches before, lost hikers who'd wandered off trail, usually found within 4 hours, embarrassed and dehydrated, but alive. Children who'd chased chipmunks into the woods and gotten turned around. Once, an elderly man with dementia who'd walked 12 miles before they found him sleeping under a tree, miraculously unharmed. He radioed for additional personnel and began organizing a grid search within a 2-mile radius of the campsite, standard procedure for a missing juvenile. By noon, 15 rangers and volunteers had spread through the forest in parallel lines, staying within sight of each other, calling Sarah's name, looking for any sign, footprints, disturbed vegetation, a scrap of fabric, anything. They found her first marker at 1:15 p.m., The brass compass lay on the trail about 800 meters north of the campsite, near a fork where the path split toward higher elevation. The leather cord was intact, still tied in the bowline knot Tom had taught her. No blood, no signs of struggle, no scuff marks in the dirt suggesting she'd been dragged. Just the compass, placed deliberately on a flat rock at the trail junction, catching sunlight, glinting like a signal. "She left it on purpose," Tom said when Deacon showed him, his voice shaking slightly. "She wanted us to know she went this way. She's smart. She's leaving markers." But which way? The trails diverged. The left fork descended toward a seasonal creek bed that ran dry by midsummer, a route that eventually connected to a logging road 3 miles west. The right fork climbed toward exposed granite cliffs, popular with technical climbers, terrain that got increasingly difficult, requiring scrambling over boulders and exposed traverses. Search teams split, following both routes until darkness forced them back. They set up a command post at the ranger station with maps covering every wall, grids drawn in marker, sectors assigned to teams. Volunteers arrived from Missoula, university students, off-duty firefighters, people who'd heard about the missing girl and wanted to help. On day 2, they found the notebook. It sat wedged in the roots of a massive ponderosa pine 300 meters up the right fork, wrapped in a plastic bread bag to protect it from moisture. The kind of clear bag that Wonder Bread came in, tied at the top with a twist tie. Inside, Sarah's most recent sketches, a hairy woodpecker with its distinctive black and white pattern dated August 6th, a rough-legged hawk perched on a dead branch, notes about calls and flight patterns. Below the sketches, words in her careful handwriting, the letters slightly irregular because she'd been writing quickly. Heard someone calling from up the ridge. Sounds like a kid in trouble. Going to check. Deacon studied the page with a sinking feeling spreading through his chest. Sound carried strangely in these mountains. Wind through certain rock formations could sound like human voices, specifically like a child crying or calling for help. He'd heard it himself on winter patrols when conditions were right. Animals, elk especially, could mimic distress calls in ways that raised the hair on your neck, or someone had deliberately lured her away. The FBI entered the case that afternoon. Agent Richard Torres from the Helena Field Office arrived with 2 other agents and a folder full of statistics about child abductions, stranger danger, the grim mathematics of recovery chances that declined with every passing hour. He interviewed every person at the campground, compiling timelines, checking backgrounds through the National Crime Information Center, looking for anyone with prior offenses. The Seattle couple had left the area the night of August 7th, suspicious timing that made Torres focus on them intensely for 48 hours. But they'd checked in with rangers at a campground in Idaho on August 8th, their story verified by multiple witnesses. Their van had been searched with their permission. Nothing. Everyone else remained at the campground, cooperative, devastated. Richard Morales took time off work to join search teams. His daughters made posters with Sarah's picture, using colored pencils to add details, hanging them at the campground bulletin board. The Hendersons organized a food drive for the search volunteers, bringing casseroles and sandwiches and thermoses of coffee to the command post. By day 4, search teams had covered 18 square miles, moving in expanding circles from the last known location. Helicopters equipped with loudspeakers crisscrossed the canopy, pilots flying dangerous low-altitude patterns, observers scanning with binoculars, calling Sarah's name through speakers so loud they echoed off the mountainsides. Bloodhounds from the Montana State Prison K-9 unit followed trails that ended at creek crossings where scent vanished, the water erasing every chemical trace. They tried tracking from both the compass and the notebook location, but something interfered, possibly the number of searchers who'd already trampled the area, contaminating the scent trail with their own presence. A volunteer named Marcus Chen, a medical student from the university, spotted what looked like a piece of torn fabric on a bush near a ravine half a mile from where the notebook was found. Green fabric, possibly flannel. Hearts raced. Teams converged. The fabric was carefully photographed, documented, placed in an evidence bag. Forensic analysis at the state lab in Helena took 3 days. The technician, a careful woman named Dr. Sarah Brennan, the shared first name and eerie coincidence, examined the fabric under microscopy, tested dye composition, analyzed fiber structure. The report came back negative. The fabric was cotton flannel, yes, but from a different source, probably a decade old based on fading patterns and degradation, weather-worn and sun-bleached, likely from a shirt discarded by a hunter or camper years earlier. False leads multiplied like bacteria in a culture dish. Someone reported seeing a girl matching Sarah's description at a gas station in St. Regis, 40 miles west, pumping gas into a blue pickup truck with out-of-state plates. Deputies investigated, tracked down the truck, found it belonged to a family from Oregon with a daughter who was blonde and 16, nothing like Sarah. The witness had been sincere but mistaken, seeing what they wanted to see. A psychic from California called the ranger station claiming Sarah was alive, held in an abandoned mine shaft, that she could see water and darkness and hear dripping. Montana had hundreds of abandoned mines. They checked every known mine shaft within 10 miles of the search area, rappelling into darkness, calling her name into voids that swallowed sound. Nothing. A construction worker in Missoula came forward, saying he'd seen a suspicious man in a brown van, watching children at a park near the university in July. Torres investigated, tracked the van, found it belonged to a contractor from Butte, who'd been doing tile work at the university and had documentation proving he'd been in North Dakota when Sarah disappeared. On August 15th, after 8 days, Ranger Deakins stood before the assembled Winters family and search coordinators in a conference room at the ranger station that smelled of old coffee and desperation. Behind him, a topographic map bristled with colored pins, marking every trail covered, every sector searched, every false lead investigated. Statistical models based on lost hiker recovery suggested that if Sarah had simply wandered off trail and become injured or disoriented, they should have found her by now. The forest wasn't infinite. Search patterns had been thorough. The mathematics were cruel but clear. "We're expanding the search radius to 25 miles, Deakins said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "We're bringing in additional air support. We're not giving up." But resources had limits. Volunteers had jobs to return to, lives that couldn't remain on pause indefinitely. By September, the active search scaled back to weekends. The Forest Service continued systematic grid patterns, but the intensity waned, replaced by a grinding persistence that felt increasingly futile. Margaret Winters stopped teaching. She requested a leave of absence that turned permanent when she couldn't bear the thought of returning to a classroom full of fourth graders when her own daughter was missing. She spent days driving logging roads in the Ford station wagon, checking campgrounds, talking to everyone she encountered, posting flyers with Sarah's photograph at gas stations and grocery stores and laundromats across 3 counties. The flyers showed Sarah smiling, taken the previous Christmas wearing a red sweater. Missing, Sarah Catherine Winters, age 14. Brown hair, brown eyes, 5'4", 110 pounds. Last seen wearing jeans and green flannel shirt. If you have any information, please contact Missoula County Sheriff. Tom built a memorial at the campsite, a small cairn constructed from stones he carried from the creek, with a bronze plaque mounted on a piece of weathered wood. He returned every August 7th for the next 12 years, camping alone in Site 17, walking the same trails, hoping some hiker would emerge from the trees with news that never came. David grew up carrying the weight of being the child who remained, the survivor, the one his parents looked at with expressions that mixed love and sorrow in ways he couldn't untangle. He graduated high school in 1981, joined the Forest Service, became a ranger himself, working search and rescue, driven by something he could never quite name. The case remained open, but cold. Sarah Catherine Winters became another name in the files of unsolved disappearances, another family broken by the wilderness and its silence, another statistic in the grim calculus of missing persons that law enforcement tracked but could rarely solve. 13 years later, in October 1987, technology developed for an entirely different purpose would crack the mystery open. The Forest Service had begun using low-altitude helicopter surveys, combined with soil analysis equipment, to map remote terrain for fire management planning. The program originated from techniques developed to locate MIA remains in Southeast Asia, specifically detecting soil disturbances invisible to the naked eye that persisted long after surface features had been reclaimed by vegetation. The science was elegant. When Earth is disturbed by digging, by decomposition, by human activity, chemical changes occur. Nitrogen levels spike from organic decay. pH shifts. Soil compaction alters moisture retention. These changes create signatures detectable with ground-penetrating radar, infrared imaging, and specialized soil sampling equipment. The military had used these techniques to locate crash sites and graves in Vietnamese jungles. Now the Forest Service was adapting them for civilian purposes. A young Forest Service geologist named Dr. Ellen Kearney had been assigned to map the Rattlesnake Wilderness for a new fire management plan. She'd earned her doctorate from Montana State, studying soil disturbance patterns after wildfires, and had jumped at the chance to work with the new survey technology. She flew with a pilot named Jack Morrison in a Bell 206 helicopter, following grid coordinates that covered sections of wilderness that rarely saw human visitors. Morrison was 62, a Vietnam veteran who'd flown Hueys in the Central Highlands and knew these mountains the way some people knew city streets. On October 23rd, flying over a section 8 miles north-northeast of the campground where Sarah had vanished, Morrison spotted something unusual. A clearing in dense forest where no clearing should exist according to their maps, which had been compiled from 1960s aerial photography and hadn't been updated since. "Taking us down for a closer look," Morrison said through the headset, his voice crackling with static. As they descended, dropping below the canopy level in a maneuver that required precise control, Kearney saw it. A structure, small, maybe 12 by 12 feet, built from rough-cut logs, chinked with what looked like mud and moss. A cabin, completely unmapped, in an area so remote it didn't appear in any Forest Service records. The roof had partially collapsed, probably under snow load from harsh winters. Vegetation had reclaimed the surrounding area, young lodgepole pines growing within meters of the walls, kinnikinick spreading over the foundation. But the most striking feature was visible even from the air, carved into the wooden door in letters 6 inches tall, weathered but legible. Sarah. Kearney's pulse quickened, her training forgotten for a moment in the flood of recognition. She'd grown up in Missoula. She'd been 11 years old in 1974, the same age as David Winters. She remembered the search, the posters, the way the whole town had seemed to hold its breath that August, hoping for news that never came. Everyone did. "We need to report this," she said, her voice tight. "We need to report this right now." By the following morning, Ranger Paul Deakins, now the district supervisor, grayer and heavier than he'd been in 1974, but still carrying the weight of that unsolved case like a stone in his chest, stood in front of that cabin with Missoula County Sheriff's deputies, FBI agent Richard Torres from the Helena Field Office, and the Winters family. The helicopter had transported them in groups, landing in the nearest clearing a quarter-mile away, the downdraft from the rotors creating waves in the grass. The hike to the cabin took 20 minutes through dense forest with no trail, following GPS coordinates and Ellen Kearney's guidance. Tom Winters moved like a man underwater, each step seeming to require conscious effort. He was 51 now, his hair completely white, his maintenance job at the university the only constant in a life that had been frozen in August 1974. Margaret walked beside him, holding his hand. David came last, in his Forest Service uniform, carrying equipment that might be needed. When they reached the cabin, when Tom saw the door, saw those carved letters, his hand reached toward them involuntarily before Torres stopped him. "Don't touch anything yet," Torres said gently. "We need to document everything exactly as we found it." The cabin sat on a slight rise, surrounded by lodgepole pines so dense that sunlight barely penetrated. No road led here, no maintained trail, no sign that anyone had visited in decades. Whoever built it had done so in extreme isolation, hauling materials on foot or by pack animal, labor that would have taken months. The construction looked old, maybe 1950s or early 1960s, based on the techniques, the hand-hewn logs, the leather door hinges that had almost completely rotted away. But someone had used it more recently. The door hung crooked, but those hinges weren't original. Neither was the padlock, rusted but modern, dating from the 1970s, based on the manufacturer's mark, visible under corrosion. A master lock, the kind sold at hardware stores for $1.50. Torres photographed everything methodically, using a Nikon F3 with color slide film, shooting from every angle, documenting the approach, the exterior, the carved name from multiple perspectives, the surrounding area for any signs of recent disturbance. His movements were practiced, professional, but his hands trembled slightly. 13 years. He'd thought about Sarah Winters regularly, wondered what had happened, carried the unsolved case like all investigators carry the ones that got away. Then he carefully pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, metal on metal, a sound that sent birds scattering from nearby trees. Inside, dim light filtered through gaps in the collapsed roof. Dust motes drifted in the slanted beams. A rough table built from split logs. A chair made from pine branches, still sturdy despite years of neglect. A sleeping platform built against one wall, still holding what had once been a sleeping bag, now just a mass of deteriorated fabric and batting. Shelves on the opposite wall held rusted cans, beans, soup, coffee, labels faded but legible when Torres examined them closely through his camera lens. Dates stamped on the cans, 1972 to 1974. And on the table, preserved in the dry mountain air that had turned the interior into something approaching a time capsule, sat a composition notebook. Torres lifted it carefully, his fingers in latex gloves. The pages were brittle, moisture damaged around the edges, where rain had penetrated through roof gaps, but readable. He opened to the first page and saw, in handwriting he would later confirm, matched Sarah Winters's school assignments from 7th grade, math homework and book reports still filed in the district attorney's evidence room. August 7th, 1974. I followed the voice up the ridge, but there's no one here. Found this old cabin. It's getting late, and I'm further from camp than I thought. I should go back, but I'm really tired and my legs are shaking. I'll rest here first, then head down in the morning. I have water and crackers. I'll be okay. Margaret Winters made a sound, something between a sob and a gasp, a noise that seemed torn from somewhere deeper than her throat. Tom held her, his arms around her shoulders, his face pressed against her hair. Torres continued reading, his voice steady, reading aloud so everyone could hear, reading the words Sarah had written alone in this cabin 13 years ago. August 8th. I tried to go back this morning, but I can't find the trail I came up on. Everything looks exactly the same. All pine trees and no landmarks. I walked in what I thought was the right direction for an hour, but nothing looked familiar, so I came back here. I'm going to wait. They're searching. I heard the helicopter this morning. I went outside and waved, but they didn't see me through the trees. I tried to make noise, but my voice doesn't carry. Tomorrow, I'll try again. August 9th. The helicopter came back today. I could hear it for a long time. I went to the clearing by the creek and waved my flannel shirt, but I don't think they saw me. The trees are too thick. I'm going to stay here at the cabin. This is my base. If I keep wandering around, I might get even more lost. Search and rescue protocol says stay in one place, so I'm going to do that. I'm eating the food in the cans. It tastes weird, but it's food. There's a creek nearby, so I have water. I'll be okay. August 10th. I carved my name on the door today, so if someone finds this place, they'll know I was here. I used a rusty knife I found on the shelf. My hands are shaking and I'm scared, but I'm staying calm like Dad taught me. He said, panic kills you in the wilderness, so I'm not panicking. I'm making decisions. I'm rationing the food. I'm purifying water by letting it settle. I'm going to be okay. August 11th. I tried walking in a different direction today, following the creek downstream because creeks lead to rivers and rivers lead to civilization. But after an hour, the terrain got too steep and I had to turn back. I'm very tired. I think I didn't drink enough water. Tomorrow, I'll drink more. August 13th. The helicopter sounds are farther away now. I think they're searching in a different area. I tried to make a signal fire, but the wood's too green and just makes smoke that doesn't rise above the trees. I'm leaving markers on trees now, breaking branches, piling rocks, walking in different directions each day, trying to find the way back. I always return here before dark. The nights are cold. I'm wearing everything I have. August 15th. I'm not feeling good. My stomach hurts really bad, like cramping. I think maybe the creek water's making me sick even though I've been careful, or the old food. Some of the cans were swollen. Dad taught me that means they're bad, but I was so hungry. I'm very tired. My legs don't want to work right. I tried to walk today, but only made it to the creek before I had to rest. August 16th. I threw up last night. I can't keep food down. I'm drinking water, but it comes back up. I'm so cold, even though I'm wearing everything. I can't stop shaking. Mom, Dad, David, if you find this, I'm sorry. I heard what sounded like someone calling and I thought they needed help. I just wanted to help. The final entry was dated August 17th. The handwriting shaky, some letters barely formed. I'm so cold even though it's summer. I can't stand up anymore. I tried to go get more water, but I fell down and couldn't get up. I'm just going to rest here a minute. Mom, Dad, David, I'm sorry I went after the voice. I love you. I tried so hard to get home. I tried everything. I'm sorry. The notebook ended there, the rest of the pages blank. Torres closed it carefully, his eyes wet. No one spoke. The only sound was Margaret Winters crying, a sound of grief renewed, 13 years of not knowing crystallizing into knowing, which was somehow worse, because now there was no more hope, no more possibility that Sarah might walk through their door one day having been held somewhere, and finally escaped. They found her remains later that day. Dr. Ellen Kearney had insisted on bringing her soil analysis equipment to the site, intuition telling her that if Sarah had died here, if she'd left the cabin and not returned, there would be evidence in the soil itself. While Torres processed the cabin's interior, photographing every item, documenting every detail, Kearney had been scanning the surrounding area with ground-penetrating radar, moving in expanding circles from the cabin, looking for any anomalies that might indicate disturbed earth, decomposition, anything. 50 meters from the cabin, down a slight slope toward the creek, following what might have been a path Sarah had worn by repeated trips to water, she detected a signature that made her pulse spike. "Sheriff," she called, her voice tight. There's something here. Soil disturbance, organic decomposition signature, approximately 18 inches down. The excavation began carefully, supervised by deputies trained in evidence recovery. They marked the area with stakes and string, photographed the undisturbed surface, then began removing earth in thin layers, sifting everything, documenting depth. 6 inches down, they found fabric. Denim, weathered but intact, still showing the distinctive weave pattern of Levi's jeans. Green flannel, faded but recognizable. A leather belt with a brass buckle. Red Wing boot leather, the distinctive tan color, stitching still visible. 8 inches deeper, they found skeletal remains in an anatomically correct position, lying on the right side in a slightly curved position, knees partially drawn up, arms bent, as if the person had simply lain down to rest and never gotten up. Dr. Patricia Hammond, the state forensic anthropologist brought in from Helena, conducted her preliminary examination on site, kneeling on a tarp beside the carefully exposed remains, working with the reverence appropriate to the dead. "Female," she said, measuring the pelvis, checking the sciatic notch angle, "approximately 14 years old, based on bone development and epiphyseal fusion, height consistent with 5'4". Dental structure." She carefully examined the skull, noting details. Height and dental records will later confirm identity beyond doubt, but this is almost certainly Sarah Catherine Winters. She continued her examination, checking each bone carefully, looking for trauma, for breaks, for any signs that might explain cause of death. "No signs of trauma," Dr. Hammond said, studying the bones with practiced care, her fingers gentle. "No fractures, no evidence of violence, no defensive wounds. The position suggests she simply lay down and didn't get up. Death occurred in situ, right here, where we found her." "What killed her?" Deakins asked, his voice rough. "Given the circumstances and her notebook entries, most likely a combination of factors," Hammond replied, sitting back on her heels, looking at the shallow depression in the earth where Sarah had lain for 13 years, while the forest grew around her. Contaminated water leading to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Possibly food poisoning from eating spoiled canned goods. Botulism is a strong possibility, given her symptoms of muscle weakness and inability to stand. Exposure. Even in summer, the nights get cold at this elevation, dropping into the 40s, when the body's already compromised, when you're dehydrated and malnourished. Hypothermia can occur even in relatively mild temperatures. She paused, looking at the evidence, reconstructing the final hours. Based on her notebook, she was severely ill by August 17th. She probably left the cabin trying to get water from the creek, felt too weak to make it back, and lay down to rest. That's where she died. The soil and forest debris gradually covered her over 13 years. The canvas of leaves, the needles, the gradual accumulation. Nature reclaimed her. Agent Torres stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the remains of a girl he'd been searching for since 1974, a case that had haunted him through promotions and transfers and hundreds of other investigations. "She survived 9 days, he said quietly. Alone. 14 years old, and she kept trying to find her way back. She left markers, she wrote it all down, she did everything right." "The helicopter searches passed right over this area," Deakins said, his voice hollow. "August 9th, 10th, 12th, 15th. I know because I flew them. I was in that helicopter. The canopy's too dense. Even if she'd been standing right here waving, we couldn't have seen her through the trees. We were right here, and we missed her." The weight of that realization hung in the air like smoke. The investigation into the cabin's history took 3 more weeks, agents and rangers piecing together how a 14-year-old girl from Missoula ended up dying in an unmapped structure 8 miles from where she vanished. Property records filed at the county courthouse showed the land fell within a parcel claimed in 1951 by a prospector named Harold Vickers, who'd built the cabin as a base camp while searching for copper deposits that geological surveys suggested might exist in the area. Vickers had lived there sporadically between 1951 and 1968, filing claims, doing some exploratory drilling that went nowhere, gradually giving up on finding anything valuable. Vickers died in a VA hospital in Billings in 1968, lung disease from years of smoking unfiltered Camels. The claim lapsed. The cabin remained, forgotten by everyone except the forest that slowly reclaimed it, unmapped because it had been built before modern survey requirements, unknown because Vickers had been a hermit who avoided contact with rangers and other prospectors. No one had deliberately lured Sarah. Acoustic analysis conducted by university researchers confirmed what Deakins had suspected. The voice she'd heard was almost certainly wind through a particular rock formation half a mile upridge, a natural phenomenon that created eerie, voice-like sounds under certain atmospheric conditions. Local hunters and hikers had reported it for years. It sounded like a child calling for help. It was just wind and stone, and the way sound waves interacted with geology. Sarah had followed what she genuinely believed was someone in distress. She'd found the cabin instead, exhausted, disoriented, farther from camp than she'd realized, and she'd gotten lost in terrain that all looked identical, endless pine forest with no distinguishing features, no landmarks visible through the canopy, no maintained trails, just tree after tree after tree in every direction. The brass compass she'd left at the trail fork. Torres reconstructed her thinking. She'd placed it there deliberately, a marker showing which direction she'd gone, hoping searchers would understand. But the search teams had split between two paths at that junction, and the one she'd actually taken, barely a deer trail, not on any map, following the terrain upward toward the sound she'd heard, hadn't been obvious. It had looked like nothing more than a game trail. The Food and Drug Administration tested samples from the rusted cans found in the cabin, shipping them to a lab in Washington, where technicians opened them carefully in sealed environments. Several cans contained Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria that causes botulism, growing in improperly sealed food, producing toxins that cause muscle paralysis. Sarah had likely ingested it when hunger overcame caution, causing the stomach pain and weakness she'd described, the inability to walk, the muscle failure that eventually killed her. She did everything right. Torres told the Winters family during a final briefing at the sheriff's office, sitting across a conference table, the complete case file in folders between them. She left markers. She stayed in one location instead of wandering. She rationed the food and water she found. She kept a record. She was smart and brave and resourceful. The forest and bad luck and circumstances beyond her control worked against her. But she survived 9 days, and that's 9 days longer than most 14-year-olds would have managed in those conditions. Sarah Catherine Winters was laid to rest on November 15, 1987, in Missoula City Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town. More than 300 people attended the funeral. Family, friends, former classmates, now in their late 20s, with jobs and marriages and children of their own. Search volunteers who'd spent those terrible days in August 1974, calling her name through the trees, rangers who'd never forgotten. Tom Winters stood at the grave and spoke briefly, his voice steady because he'd had 13 years to prepare for this, 13 years to imagine what he might say if they ever found her. "We spent 13 years not knowing," he said. That not knowing was its own kind of death. Every birthday, every Christmas, every August 7th, wondering if she was alive somewhere, if she was thinking of us, if she'd ever come home. Now we know. And knowing is terrible, but it's better than not knowing. Sarah didn't suffer long. She wasn't taken by anyone evil. She tried to help someone, got lost, and fought to survive. That's who she was. someone who heard a cry for help and went toward it instead of away. That's who she'll always be to us. He placed her brass compass in the casket, the same compass that had led them to her. Margaret added the composition notebook from the cabin, preserved now in archival plastic by the FBI evidence technicians, but returned to Sarah because it belonged with her. David, now 27 and a Forest Service ranger himself, placed the Peterson Field Guide to Western Birds their grandfather had given her, the book she'd carried everywhere, the book that represented everything she'd loved about the world. The university established the Sarah Winters Memorial Scholarship for students studying environmental science and outdoor education. The first recipient, announced at a ceremony in 1988, was a young woman planning to major in forestry and wilderness management. The Forest Service used her case to develop better protocols for wilderness searches, including more thorough mapping of unmapped structures, better helicopter search patterns using multiple passes at different times of day, coordination with acoustic specialists who could identify natural sound phenomena that might confuse lost hikers. Dr. Ellen Kearney continued using soil analysis technology to locate lost hikers and crash sites, her work leading to the recovery of 3 other missing persons in Montana wilderness areas over the next 5 years. If you'd like to support ongoing efforts to bring closure to families like the Winters, you can contribute to the Missing in the Mountains Foundation, which funds searches using the same scientific techniques that finally brought Sarah home. The cabin remains standing, maintained now by the Forest Service as an unofficial memorial. They installed a small bronze plaque near the door. Sarah Catherine Winters, 1960-1974. She heard someone calling for help and went toward it. She survived 9 days alone in these mountains with courage and intelligence. She carved her name here so she wouldn't be forgotten. She wasn't. On a clear morning in June 1988, Tom Winters hiked alone to the cabin site. The Forest Service had offered to dismantle it, to remove what they called an attractive nuisance that might draw curious visitors. But he'd asked them to leave it standing, at least for now, at least until he'd had time to make his peace with it. The hike took him 40 minutes from where the helicopter had landed, following GPS coordinates and a rough trail that rangers had marked with orange tape tied to branches. The forest was beautiful in early summer, everything green and alive, mountain flowers blooming in small clearings, birds calling from every direction. The carved letters, Sarah, had weathered but remained legible, deep enough that decades more would pass before rain and wind erased them completely. Tom traced them with his fingertips, feeling the grooves she'd cut with a rusty knife, imagining her hands doing this work. Determination overcoming fear. He sat on the cabin steps, looked up through the lodgepole pines at patches of blue sky, and felt something he hadn't felt in 13 years, a kind of peace. Not closure. He'd never have that. Margaret would never have that. None of them would. Sarah was still gone, but understanding. And understanding, he'd learned, was sometimes the closest thing to healing that grief allowed. Birds called, Clark's nutcrackers with their harsh cries, mountain chickadees singing their cheerful 3-note songs. The same species his daughter had loved to sketch, the same birds that had been here that August, witness to everything. He stayed until afternoon, sitting in silence, then walked back through the forest to where the helicopter would pick him up. Behind him, the cabin stood in its clearing, a monument to a girl who'd tried to help, who'd tried to survive, who'd carved her name into wood so she wouldn't be forgotten. She wasn't. She never would be.